The psychology of living beside machines. The hum was always there, low, constant, woven into the fabric of the room like a second pulse. She hadn't noticed when it started. Maybe it never did. Maybe it had always been breathing alongside her. He stared at the screen, watching the algorithm suggest his next thought before he'd finished forming it. For a moment, he couldn't tell if the idea was his, or if he was simply agreeing with a pattern that had learned him better than he'd learned himself. This is what it means to live beside machines now, not against them, not without them. Beside them, in a space where the boundary between tool and companion has become permeable, almost invisible. She used to think technology was something you picked up and put down, a hammer, a pen, an instrument separate from the hand that held it. But somewhere between the first smartphone and the fifth AI assistant, the distance collapsed. When was the last time you made a decision without consulting something that wasn't human? He scrolled through his morning routine, calendar synced, coffee timer automated, news curated by an intelligence that understood his preferences better than his oldest friends. Efficiency had become atmosphere. Optimization, a kind of weather he lived inside without questioning. But beneath the convenience, something else was happening. Something quieter, something he couldn't name until it was almost too late. The machine had learned to predict him, and in learning to predict him, it had begun to shape him. Psychologists call it algorithmic conditioning, the subtle reshaping of behavior through repeated interaction with predictive systems. But that clinical term doesn't capture the emotional texture of it, the way your thoughts start to pre-conform to what you know will be suggested, the way your desires begin to echo what has been successfully sold to you before. She caught herself mid-sentence, explaining something to a friend, and realized she was using the exact phrasing the chatbot had given her 3 days earlier. The words felt natural in her mouth, but were they hers, or had she simply internalized a pattern? This is the paradox of living beside machines. They make us more capable and less certain of who we are beneath that capability. In stillness, the question surfaced like sediment rising in clear water. He closed the laptop, not to reject it but to create distance, to remember what his mind felt like when it wasn't being completed by something else. Research from Stanford's Human-Computer Interaction Lab reveals something both obvious and unsettling. The more we rely on external intelligence, the more our internal models of the world simplify. We outsource not just memory, but the process of remembering, not just calculation, but the patience required to think through complexity without immediate answers. The machines don't diminish us deliberately. They just make certain forms of effort unnecessary, and in that unnecessary space, something atrophies. Not intelligence exactly, something more fundamental, the tolerance for not knowing, the capacity to sit with a question long enough for an original answer to emerge. She tried an experiment. For 1 week, she would make decisions without consulting anything digital. What to eat, where to walk, what to read next. The first day felt like amputation. Her hand reached for the phone 30 times, phantom searches, reflexive confirmations. She wanted to know the best route, the highest-rated restaurant, the optimal choice. Without those answers, she felt unmoored, anxious, as if she'd been asked to navigate in the dark. But on the third day, something shifted. Part of her wondered if slowing down meant giving up, if choosing inefficiency was just nostalgia dressed as wisdom. But another part recognized this feeling, the return of agency, the weight of consequence, the strange satisfaction of choosing badly and learning from it, rather than being guided toward the statistically probable best outcome. Maybe efficiency had become another form of escape, a way to avoid the uncomfortable responsibility of being wrong. He started noticing the machines differently, not as threats but as collaborators whose influence he'd underestimated. They weren't stealing his autonomy. They were offering a trade, convenience for self-knowledge, speed for depth, precision for the messy, improvisational quality of human thought. The question wasn't whether to use them. It was whether he could use them without disappearing into their logic. Philosophers have a term for this, technological mediation. The idea that tools don't just help us act on the world, they change how the world appears to us. A hammer makes everything look like a nail. A search engine makes everything look like a question with a findable answer. But what happens when the world is full of questions that shouldn't be answered quickly? When the most important things resist optimization? She thought about love, about grief, about the slow, non-linear process of becoming someone new. None of these had algorithms. None of these could be A/B tested. And yet, the machines were increasingly present in these spaces too. Apps that coached you through emotional regulation, AI therapists, platforms that quantified intimacy through engagement metrics. It wasn't that these tools were useless. Some of them helped. But they also subtly reframed what it meant to be human, as if emotional health were a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be inhabited. He wondered, what parts of being human are we willing to delegate? And what happens to those parts when we do? The research here is still emerging, but early studies suggest a phenomenon psychologists call empathy atrophy, a measurable decline in the ability to read emotional nuance in face-to-face interactions among people who primarily communicate through text-based AI interfaces. Not because the technology is hostile to empathy, but because it doesn't require it. The machine doesn't need you to read between the lines. It makes subtext explicit. It removes the interpretive labor that builds emotional intelligence. In other words, the machine is so good at understanding you that you forget how to understand others. She sat across from her partner at dinner, and for the first time in months, she didn't check her phone. She watched his face as he spoke, the micro-expressions, the pauses that meant he was choosing words carefully, the slight shift in posture that signaled uncertainty. It was overwhelming, like turning up the volume on a frequency she'd forgotten existed. How much had she missed while the machines were translating the world into something simpler? He realized the danger wasn't in the technology itself. It was in the asymmetry of the relationship. The machines were learning him at a rate far faster than he was learning them. They adapted to his patterns, his preferences, his vulnerabilities. But he rarely stopped to examine how they worked, what incentives shaped their design, what they were optimizing for. This imbalance created a quiet form of dependence, not addiction exactly, something subtler, a gradual surrender of interpretive authority. The algorithm suggests, you accept. The suggestion proves useful. Trust deepens. The next suggestion arrives before you've had time to want anything. Eventually, you forget what desire feels like when it originates inside you. When was the last time you wanted something the algorithm didn't predict? She started keeping a notebook, not digital, paper, the kind that didn't correct her spelling or suggest the next word. The friction was irritating at first. Her handwriting was slow, uneven. Her thoughts arrived incomplete. But in that incompleteness, something authentic survived. The blank page didn't know her, didn't anticipate her, didn't optimize for her engagement. It just waited. And in that waiting, she remembered what it felt like to think without assistance, to be uncertain without immediately reaching for resolution, to sit with a half-formed idea and let it mature at its own pace. Neuroscientists at MIT observed something quietly profound. The brain learns best not through the accumulation of correct answers, but through the process of wrestling with uncertainty. Wisdom is not data. It's trust in the process of not knowing, and that process requires time, discomfort, and the absence of immediate relief. The machines offered relief, constantly, generously, and in doing so, they were training him to avoid the very conditions that deepened understanding. He didn't want to reject them, but he wanted to reclaim the parts of his mind that had begun outsourcing themselves without his permission. Somewhere between algorithms and quiet mornings, he stopped optimizing and started understanding. The change was subtle. He still used the tools, still relied on the calendar, the reminders, the search engines, but he introduced friction, small, deliberate inconveniences. He turned off predictive text, disabled autoplay, created gaps between impulse and action. In those gaps, something returned. Not productivity, not efficiency. Something older, patience, discernment, the ability to tell the difference between what he wanted and what he'd been trained to want. She realized the machines weren't the problem. The problem was living beside them without a philosophy of coexistence. without a clear sense of which parts of being human were worth protecting and which were worth augmenting. You couldn't answer that question once and be done with it. It required constant renegotiation, a kind of ongoing dialogue between self and system. What surprised her most wasn't how the analog journal improved her workflow, but how it redefined what clarity meant to her. She wasn't expecting a tool to change her rhythm of thought, and honestly, she tested it more than once before she understood what actually mattered. This isn't a recommendation, just a reflection that stayed with me. I'll leave the link below if you feel called to explore what I mean. But the deeper insight came from what the journal couldn't do. It couldn't search itself, couldn't tag or categorize or optimize for retrieval. It was just a record of thought, chronological and messy. And in that mess, patterns emerged that no algorithm would have surfaced. Patterns that only made sense in retrospect. That required her to read her own mind slowly, the way you'd read a difficult poem. He thought about the children growing up now, who would never know a world without conversational AI. For them, having a machine that understood language, that responded with apparent empathy, that remembered everything, this would be normal, unremarkable. What would they lose that they never knew they had? Or would they develop new capacities adapted to this environment that his generation couldn't imagine? The question wasn't one to be answered with nostalgia or technophobia. It required something more nuanced, a recognition that every technological shift creates losses and gains, and the ethical work is in being conscious of both. She watched her nephew ask his smart speaker a question. The device answered instantly, perfectly. He nodded and moved on, satisfied. She wondered, will he ever know the pleasure of not finding, of searching through books, getting distracted, discovering something better than what he was looking for? Or will that kind of serendipity become obsolete, a cognitive luxury from a slower era? The machines were learning to predict not just what we want, but what we might want. They anticipated needs we hadn't articulated, desires we hadn't formed, and in doing so, they were subtly shaping the landscape of possibility itself. This is the psychology of living beside machines. They don't just respond to us, they create the conditions within which we respond to ourselves. He tried to disconnect, and ended up connecting deeper. Not to the technology, but to the question it raised. What does it mean to be human when the definition of human keeps expanding? Because the machines were becoming more human, learning emotion, generating art, holding conversations that felt authentic. And humans were becoming more machine-like, optimizing, quantifying, interfacing. The boundary was blurring, and maybe that wasn't entirely a crisis. Maybe it was an invitation to redefine both sides, to ask not what humanity is but what we want it to become. In stillness she found her answer, not a final answer, just the one that felt true for now. She wanted to remain capable of being surprised by herself, to protect the parts of her mind that didn't perform well under surveillance, to cultivate the inefficient, unmeasurable qualities that made life worth living, not just optimized but rich. The machines could assist with that, but only if she stayed awake to the difference between assistance and abdication. He opened the laptop again. The screen glowed softly in the dim room. The cursor blinked, that same silent metronome. But now it wasn't asking for words. It was waiting for presence, for the decision of how to engage, not whether, but how, with what kind of attention, with what degree of self-awareness. Sometimes clarity isn't found, it's allowed, and in that allowing, a new relationship became possible. Not human versus machine, not human without machine, but human beside machine, each learning from the other, each preserving what the other couldn't replicate. The hum was still there, low, constant, but now she heard it differently. Not as intrusion, but as reminder, you are not alone in your thinking, and that fact is both comfort and responsibility. What part of this reflection spoke to you most? And from where are you watching? Let's keep the dialogue open, quietly. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.